You are a. All right. Welcome to our May 2026 Chicago Ruby Meetup. As a reminder, we meet up every Wednesday or first Wednesday of the month, except for today. Today is Thursday. You are in the right place. All right. Can you hear me? Okay. And the folks of AlphaSense for letting us use their lovely space and being such an amazing host. With that, I am going to hand the mic off to Adam from AlphaSense to let.
Hi, everybody. I'm Adam, and I'm going to switch mics since this one seems to be cutting out. All right, how's that working? Everybody hear me? Okay, yeah. Hi, I'm Adam. I'm a principal engineer here at AlphaSense for about 2 more weeks before I take off on a summer of unemployment. But yeah, we are a financial intelligence company, so we basically have a ton of data about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of companies around the world. This can be anything from like regular commodity data like stock prices to interviews with customers, former company execs, things like that. And then we have AI tools that are built on top of this massive library of data. And we are the market leader in this area. I think our most recent announcement was $500 million a year in revenue. So we are a big company. Yeah, keep an eye out for the IPO sometime pretty soon. We are hiring currently only at the staff level plus due to just having too junior of a team and trying to level that up. We did, I think, just recently hire a Ruby staff engineer based here in Chicago. So that is a real thing we do. So keep an eye out for those listings. Check our career site. There are US staff plus roles open right now online. Yeah, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Enjoy.
Thank you so much. All right. From the Chicago Ruby organizers, myself, Anton, Dan, Josh, we would just want to thank you for coming here today and joining us. Okay, some quick housekeeping and announcements. First, join us for our future events. We will post our events on meetup.com as well as on Slack. Here's a QR code to our meetup group. All right. Speaking of Slack, we have our own channel within the Ruby Central community Slack, #ChicagoRuby, as well as the #Ruby channel within Chicago Tech Slack. These Slack channels will be a place for us to connect, as well as where Chicago Ruby organizers, such as myself, will post any announcements prior to our events. We've created QR codes for invitations to the Slack channels right there. Reach out to me if you need an invite. Okay. Yeah. Missed a previous event or want to rewatch a talk? We have our 2025 and 2026 event recordings posted on our YouTube channel at Chicago Ruby Meetups. Feel free to give our channel and videos a like and subscribe. Yeah. Interested in hosting? Chicago Ruby is on the lookout for organizations willing to host our monthly meetings. If interested, reach out to Anton, Dan, Josh, or myself, and we can give you more info. All right. Interested in speaking? We would love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out to me for more information on speaking at Chicago Ruby. If you are interested in speaking but aren't sure what topic to choose, or if there's a subject you'd like to see covered, we've put together a list of potential topics that members of the community are eager to learn more about. This QR code will send you to that list. Feel free to add your ideas on that Google spreadsheet. For moderation purposes, that Google spreadsheet is open for comments only, and admins like myself will add ideas from comments onto that list. Okay. Chicago Ruby is proudly supported by GoTo Inc. GoTo Inc. is a UX, UI, and engineering talent as a service provider for Ruby-powered organizations. We're incredibly grateful for the support of GoTo Inc. And for the support GoTo Inc. has given to our community. If you'd like to learn more about what they do, be sure to connect with Anton, who's in attendance today. If you're interested in Chicago Ruby, either by hosting a different type of event, like a hack night, a board game night, code and coffee, collaboration with other groups, or through a sponsorship, we are so down. Reach out to me for more info on sponsorships and hosting different types of events. All right. Lastly, join us next month. Chime will be hosting our June meetup. Wednesday, June 3rd, 6 p.m. to 8:30. Alan Rydell Hoover will be joining us remotely, doing a dry run of his RubyConf talk, Indispensable, as well as Tony Yunker, who will be joining us in person to talk about his learnings on testing read-only models. All right. And with that, I will hand off the mic to Hilary. Hello. I'll give you this. Okay. Here you go.
Okay, here we go. All right, so I'm going to talk about what rock climbing taught me about programming. I want to quick thank Michelle for inviting me to come down from Madison. I don't know about y'all, but I feel like our cities are just far enough apart that we're always like, oh, we should go to Chicago, we should go to Chicago. And then we never go to Chicago. So it was nice to have a reason to come to Chicago. So a little bit about me. I'm a senior software engineer at Red Canary, which was acquired not quite a year ago by Zscaler, so we work in cybersecurity. I'm currently doing a Rails upgrade from 7.1 to 8.1.3. Ask me about it. Used to be a public radio journalist before I got into tech. And relevant to this talk, I have climbed outdoors in 7 different US states. So first, I kind of want to get a sense in the room. Who here has rock climbed at least once before? Okay, good. Of those people, how many rock climb more regularly? Used to. Okay. Well, you're in good company. I'll get to that in a second. But also, this is a very common sport for programmers. So I spent way too much time trying to find actual statistics about how many engineers rock climb and could not find them. But anecdotally, and just from my own experience climbing in multiple states, there's a lot of people in tech and also healthcare, STEM generally, who are drawn to rock climbing. Somewhat of a cliche now. Plot twist, I also don't climb anymore. I did it for about a decade, and then very common, I had overuse issues and my ulnar nerve was giving me problems. Then the pandemic happened, and I wanted to be safe, so I didn't climb during the pandemic. And for everyone who has climbed, it's brutal to rebuild those calluses when they have gone away. And then all my friends who I used to climb with had babies, and they started climbing at the crack of dawn, and that's just not working for me. So I don't know. I keep thinking about going back into it, especially working on this talk, so we'll see. But like I said, before that, I was climbing for about a decade. About half that time intersected with my time as a programmer. And these are 8 parallels that I've identified between rock climbing and writing code. First one, bring snacks. Starting out deep. So this is really more like take care of yourself, right? And it's really easy to get tripped up on this, especially when you're a new climber or a new coder. Climbing is an endurance sport. Now, a lot of what I'm going to talk about comes from a sport and trad outdoor climbing background. So if you're mostly doing bouldering or climbing in a gym, it's going to be a little bit different, but that's sort of the lens through which I'm giving this talk. New parts of your body will start hurting. I did not know how big my forearms could get until I started climbing, and suddenly like sleeves didn't fit. But jars were so easy to open. It was the best. Forearms, right? Finger muscles, another thing that I never thought about until I was climbing regularly. Toe tips, because I looked this up because I had a suspicion, but I looked it up to make sure. And the shoes that you wear for rock climbing are very similar to ballet point shoes. And I think we've all seen the videos of like ballerinas' feet all messed up. Yeah, happens to climbing too. But the main thing when it comes to like self-care and rock climbing is you don't want to have an energy crash out dangling off a mountain because you party too hard at the campsite the night before, which I have seen happen. On multi-pitch routes, meaning the route is longer than the length of one rope, so you climb up to a certain point, stop, and then you start again with the beginning of the rope. I literally would carry candy, like Sour Patch Kids, in my pockets just to have that energy boost, because these would be multi-hour, like full day climbs, and you got to keep that energy. So how does this relate to coding? Don't code 12 hours a day, right? I think most of us now know that this is bad, but there are still people that I've talked to on other teams, and this happens for a variety of reasons, right? Your project's on deadline, or you're feeling a lot of pressure from your boss to produce more, or maybe you're worried about layoffs at your company, and so you're like, well, how do I make myself indispensable? I'm just going to really push myself and get a lot done. And in the short term, sometimes that's unavoidable. So actually, a couple days leading up to this, we had an issue where we discovered that one of our SAML certificates was going to expire in like 3 days. This was not good. It had been created 9 years ago. No one knew how to fix it. And so I put in a couple of very long days with some coworkers to get that fixed. We're in the clear now. It's good, right? Sometimes it just happens. But it should be the exception. Eat lunch every day. Get a good night's sleep. I'm not great at this, right? Caveat. But when I am more consistent with this, I notice that I'm writing better code. I'm feeling better about what I'm doing. I'm a better collaborator, right? I'm not feeling that afternoon drag the way that I often do otherwise. You will burn out eventually, right? Like, I think sometimes there's this idea that because we're sitting at a desk, it's easier than maybe more physical jobs. But if you do the same thing over and over and over and over again for too long, you will burn out. Even if you think it's fun when you're doing it, right? So the mountain may be metaphorical, but you can still fall off it if you're not careful. I had a job before I came to Red Canary and it crept up slowly, right? But I realized I was working pretty much every weekend, and I was working into the evenings after dinner because there was just so much to do and we had to get it done. And I liked my coworkers and I didn't want them to have to do, and I liked the clients that we were working with and I wanted them to have a good product. And my boss was an alcoholic. And it was really stressful. And I didn't realize the toll that it was taking on me mentally and physically until I rage quit and then took the summer off and just felt so much lighter and so much healthier. So watch for something like that to creep up on you, because burnout isn't something that just happens overnight, right? It takes a period of time. Yep. Right, safety first. So this one seems pretty obvious with rock climbing. Although surprisingly, indoor climbing, right, not outdoor, but indoor climbing's injury rate is 37 times lower than CrossFit. So really, if you're thinking about CrossFit, be careful. Dangerous sport. That being said, this was assigned at the entrance to Vadavoon, Wyoming, which was the second place I ever went climbing outdoors. And it says, warning, rock climbing and bouldering are extremely dangerous activities that can result in broken bones, paralysis, permanent injury, and even death. Engage in these activities only at your own risk. So that's fun, right? Everyone likes to see that on the way to something. But it's true. You can literally die from rock climbing. 49 people did in 2024. I know multiple climbers who have broken arms or broken legs in the gym doing bouldering, not even outside. The most common injuries with rock climbing are finger pulley ruptures, which is as fun as it sounds, rotator cuff strains, elbow tendonitis, and wrist issues. According to the National Park Service, however, 40% of all climbing injuries outdoors are from, and I quote, simple mistakes with gear. Oh. How do we keep our injury rates low? Stretch your muscles, right? This is a big one, especially as we get older. Make sure your rope is in good condition, or that you have a crash pad if you're bouldering. Double check your knots. Make sure your carabiners are locked. Make sure the bolts or anchors in the wall if you're doing sport climbing or top roping are trustworthy. Make sure your shoes are tied, right? These are all very simple things, and yet 40% of the time, injury results because people are not making sure that these simple things are being handled properly. And make sure your climbing partner or spotter knows what they're doing, right? This is another big way that I've seen accidents is someone who's really into climbing gets a new friend or a roommate or a romantic partner, and they want to bring them into the sport, which is great. and they forget how much they know, and they just throw that person in there, and mistakes happen. So what does this look like in coding? Right? Coding as a profession is not without its own injury risks, namely carpal tunnel syndrome, repetitive strain injuries, chronic lower back and neck pain, or severe eye strain. Right? So legit, stretching is a good idea for coding too. But generally, we're more concerned about something going wrong with our software than we are with our bodies when we're thinking about writing software. So how do we prevent things from going wrong with our software? Make sure your automated test suite is thorough and expansive. This is honestly the number one thing, especially having gone through half of a major Rails upgrade. Tests are my best friend. And we generally have a pretty good test suite. But automated isn't enough, right? Make sure that you have up-to-date manual testing plans, because there are a lot of things that for any number of reasons, whether it's performance in our pipeline, feasibility, flakiness, we just can't really have great automated tests for. So making sure that we also know how to go through ourselves and ensure that everything is working properly. Make sure there are team members that you can lean on for support, and that you know who the subject matter experts are for different parts of your code base or your application and how to get in touch with them. And then also make sure you have sufficient alerting in place for issues in production. It's impossible to be prepared for everything, right? Like the SAML certificate that was expiring, that's really something that we would probably need to have a note somewhere like, hey, in 8 years, make sure you look at this. We tried to put, as part of this process, we tried to put the expiration in the certificate itself in our secrets manager. We thought, oh, this is so clever. That way anyone who comes to look at this will see when it expires. But Ruby's decoder can't handle certificates with comments. So that just broke it in a different way. So we had to take that back out. So yeah, it's impossible to be prepared for everything that could go wrong, right? So once we've kind of gone through our safety checks, we're like, right, we got good tests. You know, I know who to talk to if something goes wrong. I'm feeling good about sort of the baseline. Then we actually make a plan. Planning is your friend, because not all flashing is the good kind. And that's a really funny joke if you know what flashing is in climbing, which is when you complete a route successfully on your first attempt without falling or resting on the rope. And everything's better with friends, right? So this was climbing at Devil's Lake outside of Madison. One of my friends used to climb with a lot, adopted a kitten, and was determined to make it a crag cat. So every time we went climbing, we brought the kitty along. She was very lazy. So this was her insisting on a ride back to the car down from the bluff. So planning is your friend. How is this true in climbing? A climbing route is really just a complex problem, right? We're starting at the base, we're trying to get to the top, and it's not often obvious how we're going to get from point A to point B. Don't lose the trees for the forest. So this is, I think, climbing, like coding, is a situation where you want to get bogged down in the details, right? If we ignore the details, that's often when we run into problems. So how do we think about every single step of the way and what we're going to do? So projecting, not to be confused with projecting. Projecting is a system of tackling a route in climbing where you look at every individual step first, and you kind of take them one at a time, and you workshop them until you feel very confident moving. You know, sometimes it's even one move, or it's a series of 3 moves, and you're only going like 5 feet. You do it over and over until you feel really confident that you've got that part down. Then you move on to the next. And at the end, you put all the moves together, and you can get to the top without issue. So the beta is a great place to start. Beta in climbing refers to sort of like the intended sequence of moves, handholds, body positions for completing a climbing route or a boulder problem. It's like a guide that most people will be able to follow, but more on that later. So just like routes or boulder problems, coding challenges can also be mapped out. So how do we do that? First, brush up on any tutorials or documentation, either external or internal. Get feedback early and often, right? So the more complex something is that we're working on, the more that we want to make sure that we're getting buy-in and that we aren't missing things that aren't obvious throughout the whole process, not just waiting until the end and then being told, oh, you forgot about this massive thing that has to be incorporated. Ask your AI assistant of choice to give you a rundown. So we had to identify several major gems in our environment as part of our Rails upgrade. And so I would have Claude go and read the change log and then look at our code base and tell me, which of these do you think are going to be the most impactful for what we're doing in our environment? scaffold different solutions before committing to one, right? I think sometimes, especially earlier career folks, want to show that they have value. They want to get something done right away. And so they just kind of the first idea that pops in their head, they're like, yeah, that's great. I'm going to do it. But it's really helpful to just sit back and think a little bit and think, okay, well, what are several different ideas that I could do? Which is the best way? What are the pros and cons? And, again, get some of that feedback. So figure out your beta for whatever you're trying to solve, and then you can move forward. Some ways to do that. Does this story make sense? We had a ticket where it was an integration that a potential large customer really wanted. And so everything was moving very, very quickly because we wanted to show this customer, oh yeah, we can get you what you want. We can fill in this hole in our software. Like, you should totally sign with us. And it involved them putting credentials in for a service, us looking at the credentials, telling them if they were wrong and displaying what the credentials should be for them to re-enter. And I went to our product person and I said, if we know what the credentials should be, why are we having them enter them? Like, that just seems like a whole extra step that we don't need. Like, we could just fill the credentials in ourselves. And I was ultimately told that he had made that same argument, but that it was really just a get it done. We don't have time to redo designs. We don't have time, just do it anyway. So that story didn't really make sense to me, but it works. Is the deadline reasonable? This is a huge one, right? I think especially now as we're seeing more stress on a lot of coding workplaces, is the deadline reasonable? Can you actually make it? Well, you need to pull in other teams, right? Because that's a good thing to identify early so you can figure out who your connections are and kind of get them thinking about it before you dive in. That being said, right, all the preparation in the world, whether for climbing or for coding, doesn't mean it's necessarily going to go the way that you want. If the crag is busy, we can't spend all day projecting individual pieces of a route because people are waiting in line. That's just rude. If we're on a deadline, we might not have time to investigate everything first before we dive in and start writing code. Luckily, there's more than one way to complete a route. Sometimes you just got to throw the beta out with the bathwater. So some climbers, maybe even people in here, although it doesn't seem like y'all are intense enough to feel this way. But I have met some climbers who think that not doing the beta is cheating. So if you're not doing it the way that the person who founded the route intended, then you're not actually doing the route, which I think is kind of ridiculous, but just putting that out there. And it's ridiculous because climbers come in all shapes and sizes, right? So this is my old climbing crew. And you can't really tell in this picture, but we had about a 10-inch height difference between the shortest of us and the tallest of us. One of us had really great natural upper body strength. Another one had a really big wingspan, and the third was super flexible. So there's no beta that's going to play to all of our respective specialties, right? Because we're all going to approach a route in a different way. Things that are hard for one are going to be easy for the other, and so on. So let's throw it out. As Isaac Asimov said, to succeed, planning alone is insufficient. One must improvise as well. So even if you studied the route ahead of time, maybe you've even climbed it in the past, there are myriad reasons why the original beta or your original strategy is not going to work anymore. For example, the ledge is smaller than you thought. You can't get the hand jam right, which is when you literally jam your hand into a crack in rock and just kind of shove it in there and then use that as a wedge to get yourself up. It's as fun as it sounds. You're not tall enough to execute the move you could thought. You're too tall to execute the move you could thought. So this happened with one of my climbing partners who was much shorter than I was. And she was like, oh, you just put your leg up here. And I was like, my knee would be above my head if I tried to do that. There's no way. Maybe it rained earlier in the day, right? And the rocks are really slippery. So the original approach you were going to take is not going to work. Or there was a rock slide that actually changed the route. So the beta itself is broken. You couldn't follow it even if you wanted to. So enter monkey patching. You might be thinking this is a programming term. Who here, does everybody know what monkey patching is? Seeing some nods. Okay, for anyone who might not, it's basically just dynamically modifying your runtime code, but not the source code. So oftentimes you'll see this with overriding part of a gem to do something specific in your environment. So many of my climbing friends were programmers that we started calling non-beta moves monkey patching. So we were monkey patching the route. There are pros and cons to monkey patching, of course, in climbing and coding. So let's look at a couple of those. Pros for climbing, especially if you're climbing outdoors, there's not always options for you to easily and safely abandon a route mid-climb. Sometimes the safest thing by far is to just figure out how to finish it. So if that means going off route, going off beta, if it gets you to the top, great, do it. It can increase your efficiency, right? So this happened a lot, especially in the gym, where my tall climbing partner and I would just skip handholds and footholds because we didn't need to. We could reach to the next one. Why are we going to waste our time and energy when we don't need it? Like, let's just get up quickly. And it can increase enjoyment, right? Because you're playing to your strengths. Cons for throwing out the beta when climbing. It can be the easy way out, right? So sure, we could easily skip some of those handholds because we were tall enough, but maybe that would have been good practice for a certain type of move, right? So for example, if I'm able to just like reach up and get the next hold instead of like pushing down and moving my body like that, I'm missing out on practice for that kind of move, which could help me in other situations where I can't skip it. It can decrease efficiency, right? So maybe the harder beta is much more direct than the easier way that kind of goes around and meets back up. And it can be less safe, especially if we're looking at trad climbing where you are placing your own anchors into the wall as you climb. If you go off beta or go off route, there might not be a great place to put your anchor. So sometimes it's the safest thing you can do is try to follow the beta as closely as possible. For coding, right? Obviously, it customizes to your own use case, which means that you have greater flexibility with what you're using. Maybe there isn't a gem that does everything you need, but there's a couple that do like 90, 95%. So if you just make a couple little monkey patches, suddenly it does everything you need it to. And it can save time, right? Because you could just rewrite all the functionality of that gem in the way that you need, but it's kind of a hard sell to management. Cons, of course, unintended consequences, because we are writing code on top of other code. It increases the difficulty of updating that library or that gem because they might change what we were overriding in an even different way and suddenly our override doesn't work. And we might even realize that's a problem because monkey patches are often forgotten about and neglected, just hidden away in code somewhere. And this can increase security risks. This is something, especially working in cybersecurity, that we think about, right? Is if you're nervous to update a gem, you might miss out on security patches or security updates because you don't want to wreck this fragile ecosystem that you've created with your monkey patch. So sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it's best to actually just stick to the beta. When are some instances where you do want to throw out the beta, though, in coding? So especially if you have a ticket that's, maybe marked as 5 points, you get into it, you realize this is actually 8 or even more, right? That original plan is probably not going to work the way that you wanted it to. And this is also true for climbing. So every route that you climb is going to have a grade associated with it. And just like assigning story points, assigning a route grading is a subjective exercise based on objective criteria. So the same people can look at the same route and come up with very different gradings, even though they're using the exact same criteria to make that designation. That's how we've always done it. Well, great. Doesn't mean it's the best way to do it, So again, having that plan, thinking of, okay, well, is there a better way? What if we did it this way instead? One exception, which is code standards, and I will die on this hill. That was actually not a climbing pun, but it works. I will die on this hill. That being said, if you disagree with the coding standard itself, make a case to change it. And then go change it everywhere. Because otherwise you end up with 3 different standards that are all partially implemented and no one knows which one to do. And that's just the worst. So really in the end, right, when we're talking about having to make adjustments, we're just iterating, right? We're trying something, seeing how it works, iterating and repeating. So agility is helpful in climbing and in programming, which is especially helpful knowing that you're never going to know everything because our brains just aren't big enough. And we have too many other things that we're trying to keep track of. So too much to know in climbing. There are so many different, climbing is a highly technical sport, and there are so many different techniques suited to specific types of situations, and you really can't know all of them. You'll probably forget multiple along the way because most routes don't require a hand jam or a heel hook, which is where you put your foot on top of a hold and pull yourself up with your leg. It's very satisfying. It's not the most fun. You don't need it very often. So when you do, there's always a second of like, oh, shit, how do I do this again? Work your way up, right? Don't ignore the fundamentals. You don't need to automatically start doing, lead trad climbing, which is where you're going up with the rope and again, setting your own anchors, right? Start with some nice bolted anchors in the wall first. And if it's your first chimney, right? Ask for help. You could just go try it. I don't know how great your results are going to be because this is what a chimney is. And this is actually a fairly wide chimney. So the first chimney that I ever tried to do was a long, tall, that was probably like 15 or 20 feet tall, narrow chimney in Vedavu, which has sharp granite, like the kind of climbing where you take athletic tape and you make yourself gloves to climb with because calluses are not enough. Your hand will get torn up by the granite. So I'm in this chimney, and I think I'm doing great. I'm about halfway up, and I fall. And it's the first fall of the day, so the rope has not stretched out, which means it stretches out with my fall. So I get almost all the way back to the beginning of this chimney. And this is like maybe 2 feet wide, so the kind where you're like going like scooching your way up. And my back just scrapes all along that sharp granite in the chimney. I do not recommend this. I should have asked for better guidance on how to get up in the first place. What does this look like in coding? So again, so many different tasks or contexts suited to different situations. It would take forever to learn them all, even at a mid-sized company. We had principals and staff and engineering directors and people from multiple different departments trying to figure out this SAML certificate issue, and no one knew how. Everyone knew like a little piece of it, but it took all of us together over several days to figure out how to actually solve our problem. You'll probably forget multiple things along the way, right? You're not spending every story, generally speaking, if you're a Ruby developer, debugging middleware, right? Or rotating SAML certificates. So write things down. Make it easier for your colleagues and for future you. I mentioned earlier that I'm doing a Rails upgrade. We had literally zero documentation about how to do this, even though we do it once or twice a year. So now we have a template for manual testing. We have a detailed how-to guide. We have a template for how do you document new features from upgrades to share with the rest of the engineering organization, and tutorials for each of the major gems that we often have to upgrade as part of a Ruby or Rails upgrade. And don't wait till the end, right? I think a lot of times we think, oh, I've got a 1-point ticket to write documentation. I'll do it at the end because then I'll know how everything works, right? Do it in the beginning, do it throughout, because too often we'll forget how we got to point A or point B. Or we'll be so familiar with what we did that we won't even think to write it down because it's like, oh, well, obviously you're going to use kubectl to do this thing. And like everybody knows that. You didn't know that. You didn't know that 2 days ago, but you forget what you didn't know. So I always think it's really helpful to just write it all down as you're going through. So sometimes I think we have this idea of, well, if I can't know everything, maybe I should just stick with what I already know, right? It's safe, it's easier. I feel very comfortable in this space. I feel like I have some expertise in this area. Maybe I should just stop there. But it's really important to embrace the unknown because you can't pick a favorite rock if you don't try them all, right? It's not granite. So what does this look like? So this is where I found there are a lot of overlaps between climbing and coding. So skills often transfer, right? If you have in climbing, if you have good core and your hand muscles are, nice and developed, like you can do a variety of different types of climbing. You might not be perfect at it, but you have the sort of base skill that you need to be able to do that. Same thing with coding. And sometimes you have to explore to figure out what you like, because maybe you've always done things a certain way, or you've always worked at companies that do things a certain way, or you always climb with friends who have the same favorite types of routes. But maybe your favorite one is out there waiting and you just haven't tried it yet. Slab versus jug, right? So slab climbing are generally very easy, big handholds. They're easy to grip, involves a lot of like power moves. It's super fun. That's for jugs. Slab is generally sort of like at a small angle, and it's really a lot of tiny, focused precision moves. So it's not really strength. It's more about core and balance. And I thought I loved jug climbing because you can just like do these big leaps and then land on the rock and hold it and feels like a superhero. And one of my friends that I climbed with loved slab and convinced me to try. And it turns out, even though it feels very opposite, I actually love slab too. But I would never known if I hadn't tried. Trad versus sport. There's so many different ones. DevOps versus web dev, front end versus back end. You know, especially in the current tech job market, the more metaphorically flexible that you can be, right, the easier time you're going to have with your job search. And your preferences might change over time. So I think this is something too, is like keeping ourselves open. When I was going through my job search before I ended up at Red Canary a couple years ago, I got lucky because I really wanted to stay in Ruby. I've only ever programmed in Ruby professionally. I didn't want to learn a new language. I didn't want to, have to work in a different community. I really liked the Ruby community. And my partner, who's also a software engineer, was like, you could figure it out though, right? Like if it was a job where you really like the mission, or they had really great benefits, or whatever the case, they're doing projects that are really interesting. Like you could figure out another language. You have enough of those fundamental skills to be able to make that transfer. Because specificity can be constraining, right? If you only want to climb granite slab and you live in an area that only has like southern sandstone jugs, you're kind of out of luck unless you're willing to be flexible and try something new. And you don't want to miss out on something awesome, right? You don't want to get stuck in that rut and miss out on something that could be really fulfilling. Because if you're always doing the same things, it can get boring really quickly. So go nuts. Try new things. We went to the climbing gym and we all wore capes one day because we thought it would be fun. And guess what? It was super fun. If you're flashing every single route, so completing it on the first try, if you're doing every story in an hour or 2 hours, you're not challenging yourself, right? And you're probably not having that much fun. That being said, it can take a long time to build calluses. I actually saw a post in the Climber Girls subreddit where a new climber requested callus advice for weak baby hands. General consensus was 1 to 3 months, depending on how often you climb. So now you know. You're literally molding your body when we try new things, right? Whether it's climbing routes or whether it's coding. So I mentioned earlier, you have to break in climbing shoes, especially if you're going to be doing stuff outdoors. You have to break in your brain for coding. We're literally creating new pathways in our brains. Equipment can vary between gyms and between jobs. What kind of belay device are they using at the gym? What kind of testing framework are you using? What if you've only used Minitest and now you have to use RSpec? Based on the gym or the city, different types of routes are going to be more popular. And so you might have to adjust your climbing style to whatever is available to you in the gym. What about linters? My first job, we had 0 linters. Red Canary, we have like 8. And I hated them at first, and now I love them because your preferences can change over time. The list goes on, right? And at some point, you might be thinking like, okay, I have thick calluses. I have giant forearms, right? My climbing shoes fit me like glue. I've done all my safety checks. I've studied the beta. I'm prepared for anything that could go wrong. That feels like a lot of work to just climb a big rock. Like, what is the point? It's all worth it at the end. Climbing is a challenging sport. Coding is a challenging job. It can be easy to look at a new route and think there's literally no way for someone to climb that with just their fingers and their toes. Like, that's not a thing. Or this page is timing out at 32 seconds right now, and you wanted me to get it under 5 seconds? No, that's not a thing. That's not possible. We can't do that. But there's always a way. So many climbers are coders because we like a constant series of problems to solve over and over and over. And it's all worth it for the view. Like a finished Jira epic. So in summary, bring snacks, safety first, planning is your friend, there's more than one way to complete a route, you will never know everything, embrace what you don't know. Remember that it takes a long time to build calluses, but it's all worth it at the end. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, if anyone has questions for Hilary, we'll do like 1-2 minutes. Questions? Yeah. I'll give this to you.
Sure. Yeah. Do we have another mic? The coding equivalent of climbing a mountain. Ooh, yeah, like a multi-pitch. Yeah. I meant to look up what the longest route I've climbed is. It was at Yosemite and it was like 4 pitches. I don't remember how tall it was. But what's the equivalent to that? I mean, really any multi-month epic, probably, right? Because things can and will go wrong. There's really no way to predict what's going to happen in the middle. But hopefully you do get to the top at the end eventually, even if you have to call in friends for more snacks. So, yeah.
One. Okay, so there wasn't a single word about AI in your talk, so that's why I decided that it's a good moment to add something about AI. And what I noticed lately, some articles about AI as a vampire, and how does it feel for you? Did you notice this kind of moment that right now you can way easily burn within 8 hours per day, and AI contributes to this additional burnout? Because for me, it got much more complicated to balance my working hours. So you can work the same time with AI and get literally exhausted. So how do you handle it?
Yeah, totally. Great question. I did mention AI once. I said you can use Claude to summarize things for you, but no, it was a brief mention. Yeah, I think that's very true, and I do get a little frustrated by the push toward AI without much, if any, training. So we use AI a lot at Red Canary. I have found, and I was part of a couple of pilots, so I felt like I did get some additional training, and we had Slack channels, and we're sharing best practices and making some documentation, and so I feel like I've figured out for my workflow how it can generally be a helper and not a hindrance. But I still don't understand why there's not, like, I don't think there were any, like, even one-off sessions on like prompt engineering. It's just like, oh, go use this. It can be helpful. It's like, cool. And I think that's another tool where like so many tools, expecting everyone to use it the same way is less than helpful. Because everybody thinks in a different way, everyone collaborates in a different way, and it really is kind of like a collaborator. So I think we need a lot more training for people to really be effective with it. And I think the more effective with it you are, the better you understand its boundaries, the better you understand how it can fit into your sort of daily work, the more it becomes a helper and the less it becomes a contributing factor to burnout. But you're totally right. I mean, I was playing a board game with some friends the other day, and he's having Claude run some kind of big calculations or generate something in the background, and every like hour he would take out his phone and check it and like tell it to keep going, and I'm like, dude, it's your move. Yeah, I mean, I think there's way too much emphasis on how it can be helpful and not how to make it helpful, personally.
One more question and then on to.
I found on programming teams, there's a lot of value in having different experience levels, not just so that less experienced people can get mentorship, but also they have a sort of like fresh-eyed enthusiasm, questioning established things that cause you to reconsider them. Is there an equivalent to that in climbing, or would you pretty much always rather climb with people who are at your level or above?
Oh, that's a great question. First, I agree 100% with your primary premise. I was on a podcast last year, and I think I spent 30 minutes berating the host for why people should hire juniors. With climbing, I mean, some of that is still true, right? Especially if you are flexible with beta, right? Having someone who's going to look at the rock with different eyes can be really helpful. Sometimes even just the enthusiasm is really nice, because especially for outdoor, like multi-day outdoor climbing trips, like you're camping, you're not probably getting great sleep. Sometimes there's that you're only having fun once you get started, but actually trying to, you might have to hike for an hour to even get to the base of the climb. And that can just be boring or demoralizing, or, you stop seeing how pretty everything is because you're like, oh, it's another, hike in a national park to go climb a big rock. And so sometimes having people who are newer to the sport who are like, oh my God, like, look, people keep stacking rocks everywhere. And like, look, I saw a squirrel. I'm like, do you think we'll see a wolf? And it's just like, you know what? This is great. This is awesome. Like, we are so lucky we get to do this. Like, yeah, let's go. So yeah, I find that's probably a big one with climbing. I do think because it is so technical and because there's such strong elements of safety to it, that I would not want two newbies to, especially outdoor climbing, like top roping, I would not want two newbies to go together. Because also, how many of us have read stories about people who get trapped on mountains, right? And can't get down or injure themselves and are unable to like hike back to their car. So experience does play a role for sure. And that doesn't mean that people with less experience don't contribute to, the overall like vibe or whatever. So. Okay, thank you.
Hilary. We're going to take a 10-15 minute break, use the bathroom, grab more pizza if there's still more pizza. And then, oh, yay, here. So we'll be back in 10-15 minutes. This. Test. Hello. Hello. We're going to get started up again. Presenting our second speaker, Eva. Give her a hand.
Thank you, everybody. Great to see you all here tonight at Chicago Ruby. Thank you, Michelle, for the introduction and for continuing to host these every month. It's amazing. My talk today is called Yes and Ruby's Secret Talent for Improvisation. To begin, try something together. If I might have a willing audience participant, you're going to work with me in something a little spontaneous. We're going to build a very, very short story together. I'm going to offer up a sentence, and the only rule for the response is to start with yes and. So if I might, if that's all right, I might start with a sentence. I've only been here for 20 minutes and already I'm going to pick up a new sport. And you might respond with,
yes, and that sport might involve climbing.
It just might. Beautiful. Thank you. Round of applause. Amazing. We just built a story together on the fly with a simple tool, yes and. Many of you may be familiar, or you may not, is a very key foundation of improvisation. The idea behind yes and is that you are building something with your partner, your scene partner, or your teammates, and you're creating something together out of nothing. Improvisation, by its nature, is ephemeral, and that's all of the fun. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how Ruby also really leans into this concept of yes and. Like I said, the idea is that you accept what's given. So I offered up a sentence and it was heard, and you add something new to it. That's improv, baby, and that's Ruby. A little bit about me. My name is Fat Rabone. I live in Chicago, obviously. I do live on the street from Second City, where I spent years learning and playing improv. And by day, I work at Launchpad Lab. We're a small digital product agency, also headquartered out of Chicago. Among the many roles that I play at Launchpad, I'm still actively writing Ruby code, shipping apps to production, and having a blast doing it. Sure. How's this? Amazing. Improv beat number 2. Beautiful. With that, I'd also like to introduce some of my scene partners. What we're mostly going to talk about today, which are blocks, procs, and lambdas, 3 of Ruby's wonderful functions that it offers. We're going to take a look at how each of them adhere to, or in some cases, really don't adhere to, the principles of improvisation. We'll see how they pass control, how they accept what's given, and how they play to the absurd. Let's start with this idea of passing the mic, just like we saw in our first example. And we'll see how blocks really do this very well with the yield keyword. So in improv, one key rule that you want to abide by is that only one person speaks at a time. In improv, it's really imperative that you listen. If you're not hearing or listening to your partner, you can't yes and them. You're not going to know what they're saying, and you won't know how to build with them. The idea here is that you hold that stage, you offer your contribution, and then you pass it off to your partner. So let's take a look at blocks. Blocks hopefully are quite familiar to people in this room who are writing Ruby pretty regularly. This is an example of a method called scene that is taking a block. This is one conventional notation with the do and end keywords. The block itself is the anonymous function. It's the expression that we have within those 2 keywords. In this example, a simple put statement. The nice thing about blocks, as we'll see, is that they can actually be passed to any method at all, any method in Ruby. And it's really up to the method to decide if and how to use that block. So let's take a look at what that scene method could actually look like. In this case, pretty simple method, but it starts off with another put statement, You could think of this as the offer or setting the stage. We're then going to use our yield keyword, and then we're going to have some more code, try to close out the scene. This yield keyword is a special keyword that simply says handoff right here. And in this case, we expect to receive a block. You can also check for and put more guards around using or not using blocks with the block given keyword. But in this case, we want to use blocks, so we'll just use our yield keyword. So let's see how this all comes into play. We'll see this in action. So we have our scene method. Here's our other notation for using blocks, which is the curly braces, which is what I'll use a lot more throughout the rest of this talk. If you remember, we had an offer. We set the stage. Then we hit yield, and we see the expression in our blocks. We pass it off. When the expression in the blocks is done, we come back to the scene. And this kind of feels like a conversation, and it's definitely the way I think about it in Ruby. And the yield keyword is this idea of handing off and receiving back. The nice thing about yield is that you can do anything with that. You can capture that in a result and then do something with that result. You can really start to see how expressive and flexible Ruby can be by offering this idea of an anonymous function that can be passed to any method at all. So just to recap, we had a scene method. It did some work. We yielded. And then we were able to complete some more work at the end. Well, it's really cool that you can pass a block to any method. But what if you want to pass 2 blocks? Unfortunately, Ruby does not like that so much. And we're going to get the syntax error. Unexpected brace, expecting end of input. And this is a bit of a hint as to the design behind this, which is that with anonymous blocks, you can only pass 1 at a time. Why might this be? Well, because they're anonymous. They don't have a name. How would that yield and any other subsequent yields know which block you wanted to work with? On stage, how would you know which offer to take, what direction to go in if you're just hurled a bunch of different ideas from all your partners, right? Okay, well, what if we did want to give it a name and pass it around? Ruby lets you do that. Amazing. The way that you would do that is a little bit like this. So this is our exact same scene method as we saw before, but we've got some slightly different, we're introducing some more syntax here. So what I first want to call out is our name parameter here and that pink ampersand. This is a conversion operator. What this ampersand is going to do inside the method is going to take the block that it's receiving and convert it to a proc, which we're going to talk a lot more about. From there, if we want to invoke that block, we could actually also call yield here, but it's more conventional to use this call method. And the call method is one of several ways to call a proc, but it's the more conventional one you're most likely to see in Ruby code. Again, Ruby loves to offer many ways to do things, but I think that using call here is a good way to remind myself that, okay, we're converting it to a proc and we're going to treat it as such. So this will evaluate in the exact same way as we did before, which is amazing. So now you might be wondering, great, well, we named our scene partner. So what if we name a couple scene partners? Yikes, still no. Ruby does not like that either. Again, we get a syntax error, slightly different one. Unexpected comma here, expecting closing parentheses. It's kind of the same idea as the other error, which is that Ruby only expects 1 block. If you are going to try to name your block and convert it to a proc with this notation here of the ampersand and the name parameter, you can only do this 1 time, and it has to be at the end of the method. The principle behind this is that 1 block in and of itself tends to meet most of the use cases for these instances where you want to evaluate some quick ephemeral code. There's not a lot of use cases for needing to do that multiple times. You're probably working with a much more complex system that could be broken down. And that was by design. So as we saw, blocks, incredibly powerful, anonymous functions that Ruby offers that you can pass into any method, but you only pass it into 1 method at a time, 1 block at a time. There's only 1 mic between them. So let's move on to Act 2, accepting the offer, where we'll talk about arity, or the number of parameters or arguments that the methods will receive, and how our functions and our players work with those. Before we do that, I'd like to try something again. Maybe I'll pick on this side of the room. I'm going to start a story again. I'm going to offer something up. And this time, the only rule is you say no at the beginning of your response. So for example, I might say, surprise, I'm buying you a kitten today. And you might say, great, nailed it. Amazing. And the scene ended. There was nowhere to go. I just got shut down. Thank you for humoring me with that. It brings us to our next rule of improv. As you all saw, that wasn't the most fun scene, though it did get a laugh for the bit. But another key truth in improv is to never deny the premise, right? This is building on our first truth, in which you are meant to accept the offer so that you can build together. The fastest way to kill a build is to say no, to shut it down. So when in doubt, don't deny the premise, work with it. You accept whatever your scene partner offers you and you work with it. Now, you don't have to work with everything they said. You can pick and choose. So let's see a little bit of that. So let's come back to blocks, since we talked a little bit about them already and we're familiar with them. Let's make our method a little bit more interesting, and let's see how blocks do with different arguments, different number of arguments. Here we have our scene method again. I've compacted it quite a bit, but I have introduced the fact that the method itself takes 2 parameters. And in this case, we can happen to pass both of those parameters off to the yield as arguments. However, we're going to define our block towards the end with the do and end and the line parameter in pipes. So within pipes is how you'd pass parameters to blocks, or define those parameters so they can accept arguments. And in this case, if you were to run this code, our scene method with our line block, you would just get the first sentence there, the offer. I'm playing pickleball. I love pickleball. So what we're seeing here is that the block doesn't care that you gave it 2 arguments. It will happily just ignore that. It's not going to cause a stink at all. Block says I only take 1 argument, 1 line. You gave me 2, that's fine. I'll just ignore it. No errors there. Amazing. The nice thing is this works in the other direction too. What if we do only pass 1 argument to yield, but we define 2 parameters in our pipes there at the bottom? Once again, yield, really chill player. It says, fine, whatever, I'll take it. Whatever you give me, I'll work with it. In this case, we're going to get the exact same result. And what I want to point out is that we're not going to get an error just because punchline happens to be missing. If yield does not receive a certain number of, all the parameters that it defines as arguments, it will simply assign nil. So in and of itself, this won't error. Obviously, you tried to call something on that nil argument, you would get an error. That's on you as a bad scene partner, not Ruby. All right, let's see maybe why this is helpful. This is kind of a contrived example, but you could see that we could do all sorts of things with these mixing and matching of these parameters, and to note here that you can call yield as many times as you want. Much like we saw in our earlier design, you're probably not passing a lot of blocks around. You're probably not actually going to call yield multiple times. It's kind of a struggle to think of this use case, and I was kind of poring over some code over the last few years, and I couldn't really find a good example, but I want to show you that you could. The fun part about Ruby is sometimes you just do things because you can. In this case, we're going to call yield twice. We're going to mix and match our number of arguments there, our arity, and we're going to get what seems like a semblance of a decent story here. I'm playing pickleball, and the ball is made of cheese. Nice. We've heightened the joke. Laughter ensues. So we saw a lot about how blocks do this, and this is probably a pretty good segue to bring out our other scene partners on stage, the proc and the lambda. And we're going to see how they work with arguments as well. And what I want to set here is how I've thought about these two. For whatever reason, pretty much everyone I've ever talked to has been like, I cannot for the life of me remember the difference between a proc and a lambda. I'm really hoping this helps. The way that I think about these two is that the proc is more of a loose improviser, very go with the flow, probably a hint to what we're about to see here. And this can work really well and can really heighten a scene, or it might run us into some trouble. A Lambda, on the other hand, is more of a by-the-book player. It does really well with what's known as game improv. So games and improvs have very specific rules. You follow each beat, and you're good to get the punchline at the end. That's more of the Lambda. The proc, more long form, more fluid. Let's see what I mean by that. Proc is going to play fast and loose. And why is that? Well, what is a proc? A proc is a first-class object in Ruby, and all it is an object that encapsulates a block. Same syntax we saw with the braces and the parameters and pipes. You can instantiate a new proc by calling proc.new, or as we'll see later, you can also do it with the already instantiated lowercase version, lowercase proc. In this case, I'll show the first version, and very contrived example, but the idea here is that procs, when it comes to Arity and their arguments, work just like blocks, and that makes sense based on what we've seen here. Again, if you happen to pass only one argument to the proc, which again, we're using the call keyword here, it's totally fine. It's not going to error unless you did something weird with your nil values. So we'll happen to get an incomplete message, but that's on me. Let's see how Lambdas do that. So a Lambda is really just a type of proc. There's under the hood is just a flag that says, is this a Lambda? And if so, we're going to enforce some slightly different behavior. The way that you define Lambdas in Ruby, like all things in Ruby, there are multiple ways to do it. You could do it with the lowercase word Lambda, but the more conventional way that I've seen in articles and in code that I've seen is to use the stabby Lambda, which is what that arrow is called. I don't know how we converged on that, but all right. That's another operator there. And in this case, if you're going to use a stabby Lambda approach, you keep your argument or parameter definition outside of the block, so to speak. So again, we have a block and braces, and we're going to define our parameter list outside that in parentheses. I used to always kind of forget and get confused about this until I realized a little bit why. And the reason is that Lambdas are going to behave far more like methods. Methods are very strict with their arguments, and so are Lambdas. That's one of the flags of behavior that is set when you instantiate a Lambda. Excuse me. In this case, we defined two parameters, but we only passed in the one argument. We are going to get an argument error, just like you would a method. As I alluded to, Lambdas like to play by the book. They like to keep to the structure. If you try to deviate, they kind of go haywire and they don't know what to do with that, for better or for worse. So if Lambdas are just like methods, why not just use a method? Well, you certainly could. No reason why not. Let's see, though, why you might want to choose one or the other. So let's take a very simple method. It takes a character and a scene, and we're going to do something with those two things. If I wanted to build a whole set around the man in black, I would have to call this method every time and pass the character in just to give him a new scene to be in. With Lambdas, you can do something a little bit different. A Lambda is going to remember its character. So let's say I am going to use a bit of a factory method here. So there's still a method in play called create performer. This time, the method itself only takes the one argument, a character. Our Lambda there inside is also going to take an argument, a scene, and do things with it. So what does that translate into? Well, I might instantiate my Dread Private Roberts as the man in black. I will go ahead and call my Lambda with whatever scene I want, and the Lambda will remember the character from within the scope that we defined it. And what we're seeing here is one of the very, very cool things about Ruby's functions, which is that they encapsulate the lexical scope in which they're created. So this idea that the character was available to the Lambda within here means it will hold on to it even if you evaluate it different times with different arguments. Why is this idea of lexical scope important? Well, it comes into play when we think about what happens when things might tend to get a little bit weird. So We'll see more about this lexical scope and the ways these functions offer up different aspects of control flow. In improvisation, there's this idea of sweeping the scene, and that is an indication that the scene has ended. It's very simple. Someone in the scene or someone off stage can simply run across it, and everyone knows the scene is done. You don't get to say anything else. You all move on and do your next scene. The beauty of this is that too is improvised. There are no rules for sweeping scenes. Ideally, you're sweeping off of a big laugh, or if a scene is kind of falling apart and you want to save your team members. Point is, when someone sweeps, the lights go down, whether you are ready or not. Okay, let's see how our players handle sweeping their own scenes. Oops. We're going to come back to our lambdas that we just saw. And in this case, the return keyword is sort of the analogous sweeping of a scene, right? Trying to exit. We're coming back to our scene method with some different punchlines. Shake it up a little bit. Don't say you saw something twice here. And we'll have our offer. We'll have a lambda. In this case, a simple example, no arguments or parameter list. We'll have a return. I know it's a bit contrived because we're just having a print statement, but the point is that there is an explicit return there. We're going to call our lambda within the method after defining it and attempt to close out our scene. If we evaluate this method, what might happen? So we'll get that first offer that we set in our scene. The lambda is going to come in with its part of the conversation, and we'll complete the scene. Amazing. That's beautiful. Exactly what we want to see. We built, we heightened, we moved on. Well, let's see what a proc might do. Same exact method. We're just instantiating a proc. Here's that other notation that I described, the lowercase p proc. Exact same idea, explicit return, same scene. It's going to do its best. We're going to provide the offer. We're going to initiate the scene. Proc's going to come in hot with its bit and then kill the whole thing. Dang. Never got to the end of the scene. Someone swept a little early. So that's unfortunate, but maybe not at the end of the world. Okay, maybe you did want to exit early. Maybe I followed the map was exactly the laugh that you wanted to land on. Amazing. Well, hold on a minute. If we're going to exit early, what happens if I try to define this proc outside of a method? So now we're defining that same proc. We're going to save it to a variable, which is the really cool thing about procs and the subsets lambdas. Exact same thing. We can go ahead and call that proc inside of our method. And let's see what happens. So we'll start the scene. Amazing. Proc's going to come in hot. Yikes. The whole lights came down. Everybody left. There's nothing. There's no show. There's no theater. Nothing. The proc said, "Nuh-uh, we're done." This local jump error, I've definitely seen it before. I've definitely been bitten by it. And now I know why. So the reason for this is that, as we discussed, the idea of lexical scope and the fact that these procs and their subsets, lambdas, have the lexical scope of when they were defined. In this case, this proc was defined outside of the method. I realize it looks a little bit like it's in the abyss right now, but you imagine it's a class or something like that. And it has nowhere to go. So that's why you get the local jump error. You're jumping out of your local scope. So if there's nothing else you remember tonight about procs and lambdas, I will try to leave you with this. Lambdas, when they try to exit a scene, they simply say, "I'm done. Your turn again." A proc says, "We're done." Everyone goes home. All right, let's bring it all back for some final laughs. We talked about a lot of the cool things about Ruby's functions. We talked about how they hold focus and then they pass it off between themselves and methods or other pieces of code, and how they share the stage together. We saw how they accept and adapt to what they're given, or in some cases they don't, and that might be by design. And you may want to intentionally use lambdas to signify the strict design that you're trying to accomplish. And finally, know your exit. Know when you want to return and be cognizant of where you're going to return to, if anywhere at all. So with that, Ruby doesn't just run your code. it listens, it accepts the offer, and it says, yes, and seen. Thank you very much. Tickets are $5 at the door. Happily take any questions and do my best to improvise the answer.
I don't have a question, but I can give some feedback on why we have the snappy lambda look like it does.
Yeah, I love that.
It's contrived as hell, but Matt's explained that if you take the arrow and you rotate it, it looks like the lambda character.
Oh, very nice. Love that. Love that. I'll have to add that back in. It's awesome. Thank you. Cool. Any other questions, feedback, bits we want to try out together?
So I faced the difference between proc and lambda a while ago, and I'm curious, some practical examples. When did you face to go on such low level and to really pick between them? So you like, what was the last practical case when you used it? Because I know that sometimes they can be really powerful, but their usage is quite limited to some certain cases. So maybe you have some suggestions where when it's a good, those are good cases to use them.
Sure, I can take a stab at that. I'll first start by saying I'm sure, well, if y'all have used Rails, you've probably seen a lot of Lambdas when you've been defining scopes. Or if you've used active admin, it's DSL encourages Lambdas as well for defining collection filters and things like that. And I imagine it's converged that way because if you're going to define a scope that takes an argument, you probably want to be pretty intentional about that argument being there when you're then performing the query that you have in your scope definition. But to step back from that, what I have kind of come across and seen either in code that I was flipping through from myself or teammates or some gems that I like and all the articles that I've been reading, these functions tend to be most helpful with configurations. So if I can imagine you could build something like an adapter pattern where you're swapping out different adapters and you might want to encapsulate those in some way. So you could pass a proc and say, hey, the method itself doesn't super care what it receives, but I can encapsulate, a simple adapter or something like that within a proc, or if you want to be more strict about it, within a Lambda. That's probably the most common way. More simple examples I've seen are, I saw some simple examples about wanting to format something in different ways. And you could kind of maybe define a proc or a Lambda to provide different formatting options based on a value that's received or something like that. So those are just a handful of examples. I'm curious if anyone else has some good examples too.
The way of accessing a Ruby method as an object, is that a Lambda or proc under the hood, or is that a different thing altogether?
That is definitely part two of this talk. So there are something I maybe didn't say as clearly because I didn't want to go down this rabbit hole quite yet, but I would love to, is there, when I talked about the ampersand here, this operator, and I said that it's converting the block to a proc. What it's doing is it's calling to proc. And there are a handful of things in Ruby that respond to proc, which are blocks, symbols, methods, and hashes, I believe was the other one. It was kind of weird. Things get really kooky at that point. So I don't know that I would say the statement is that a method is a proc under the hood so much as you can call to proc on it and do interesting things that way. But I definitely could do a deeper dive to kind of explore that.
Method returns a method object.
Yeah, okay.
Then you can call to proc on to
Okay, so you
make
get
it
a
a
conversion to make it a
detached.
proc.
Yeah.
Not native to that. Okay.
Thank you. That was a much better explanation.
Still be interested in part two. Thoughts?
Yeah, there was a lot of cool stuff that I read and saw that, yeah, I mean, to your question, like, frankly, it's not that used. Maybe like in a lot of kind of the web apps that we build, I probably would imagine I would see a lot more of these things used in gems and things like that, where they have to be able to provide so much more flexibility to all the different use cases for the gem. So yeah, going into a deep dive on some of these like underlying topics. I mean, could do a whole thing on, binding and exactly how these are closures or not closures. I mean, there's so much more to talk about. So maybe I will write a part two. Cool. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, we have, I don't know what time it is anymore. Oh, sorry. Yeah. We still have the space until 8:30. There's still a little bit more food as far as I can tell, so feel free to grab more. Yeah, but other than that, we'll see you next month. Thank you.